Alright, so in today's lecture we're going to finish chapter 1 and then continue on to chapter 2. But before we jump into chapter 1, I want to cover the participation quiz question that we had on Wednesday. So Charles Darwin published his Origin of Species by means of natural selection back in 1859 that discussed his trip on the Beagle to the Galapagos Islands. And in that publication he made two main points. The first is that species showed evidence of descent with modification from common ancestors, meaning that the present day populations had modifications from those of their ancestors. If we're talking about finches, if it was a dry season, you had increased beak size, so the descendants had increased beak size compared to the ancestors which had a smaller beak size. And then the second is that natural selection is the mechanism behind the descent with modification. So the reason why the current population of finches had a larger beak size is because natural selection selected for the larger beak size. By having drier years and larger seeds, those finches that had the larger beaks could crack open the seeds, obtain food, and reproduce, and therefore they passed on their genetic code to their descendants, while the finches with the smaller beak size were unable to do so. And so that is natural selection. So from that, Darwin inferred that individuals that are best suited for the environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. So you're able to get more food, able to reproduce, and pass on your genetic code. And over time, more individuals in the population will have the advantageous trait. So at the beginning, before the dry season came, you had a population that was a mixture of small and large beaked finches. The dry season came. Only those finches that had the larger beak size could survive. So then those finches would pass on their genetic code, while the smaller beak-sized finches died out. And so in the current population, you no longer see this small beak size, you only see the large beak size. And that is again because the natural environment selects for the beneficial trait. So if we look at the question from Wednesday, Darwin proposed the theory of evolution through the process of natural selection. Darwin used the term natural selection to mean what? So A, the idea that living organisms today descended from a succession of ancestral species. So the statement is true. Living organisms today did evolve or descend from ancestral species, and there is a distinct line that you can see of branching. However, that has nothing to do with natural selection. So while the statement is true, it doesn't answer the question. The second, an individual organism changes during its lifetime to adapt to its environment. So natural selection and evolution happens on a population scale, non-individuals. Individuals do not evolve, populations evolve. So this statement is just false, so it will not be the correct answer. And then finally, C, some heritable traits of a population are selected for or against by the environmental conditions. So this is what natural selection is. Natural selection is an environmental condition that selects for a trait, in our example, dry seasons leading to larger beak size required for cracking seeds. And so that would be the correct answer for this question. Alright, so now we're going to go back to what we were talking about on Wednesday and continue on energy transformations. So various cellular activities of life are work, such as movement, growth, and reproduction, and all of this work requires energy. Life is made possible by the input of energy, primarily from the sun. So again, if you think back to the different the different kingdoms within the domain Euchaea, you have the plants, which primarily get their energy source from the sun. You have animals, which primarily get their energy source from either other animals or from plants by consuming them. And then you have the fungi, which gain their energy through decomposing organic matter. So the transfer of energy from one form to another. So most systems are solar powered. So again, photosynthesis in the plants creates the energy. So plants take the photosynthetic light, turn that into energy, which they can store inside sugar. So plants and other photosynthetic organisms are producers. They capture the energy that enters an ecosystem as sunlight and convert it, storing it in chemical bonds within sugars and other complex molecules. So most often it's transferred into glucose, a type of sugar. So if we look at a schematic, you can see that sunlight comes down, and then the producer or the plant uses photosynthetic to capture that energy and make glucose. You also see that a large number of energy is lost as heat. The transfer of energy is an imperfect system, and a lot of energy is wasted or lost as heat. Once the producer generates the energy source as glucose, you can then have consumers, such as an animal in this case, a giraffe, eat the producer and then change the energy in the glucose to ATP, which is the primary energy source for animals. And again, you can see that there's heat lost during this transfer of energy. This is how we as humans and how animals keep ourselves warm. This is why we're warm to the touch, is because we're doing all these reactions that give off energy. We lose heat. And you can see here that there is a cycling of nutrients. So chemical energy is passed through a series of consumers that break bonds and releasing the stored energy and putting it to use. So producers take the energy from the sun and put it into some type of energy unit, usually glucose. And then when you break the bonds, you release energy. So when a consumer eats the leaf and gains the glucose, it can then break the glucose molecule, which then gives off energy. So in the process of these energy conversions between and within organisms, some energy is converted to heat, which is lost through the environment. This is back to that schematic. So this is an imperfect system where a lot of heat is given off. So thus, energy flows through an ecosystem, it enters as light, and then it exits as heat as it's eventually broken down. So every object in the universe, both living and non-living, is composed of matter. In contrast to energy flowing through an ecosystem, matter is recycled within an ecosystem. So that was going back to the cycling. So energy is cycled within the ecosystem. So all of the materials cannot be, while they change, you cannot destroy or create matter. You can just change the form in which it's in. So within all living cells, a vast network of interconnected chemical reactions, collectively referred to as the metabolism, continually converts energy from one form to another as matter is recycled. So again, going back to photosynthesis and glucose, so the producer takes in the sunlight, it uses that energy to produce glucose, which is a type of metabolism. It uses metabolism to create glucose. It gives off heat as a byproduct. That glucose is then consumed by a consumer, which then breaks down the glucose to make pyruvate or other molecules through metabolism. And so all of those molecules of matter are recycled. They're changed as they progress through this chain, but they're always consistent, and then the energy is cycled within. Alright, so that's all we're going to talk about energy transformations today. Again, this is just a brief overview. We're going to go in more in depth later in the semester about the energy transformation cycle. So next we're going to talk about the interconnections within systems. So the study of life extends from the microscopic scale of molecules and cells to that make up a whole organism, or you can go even larger to the global scale of the entire planet. So the largest, most broad scale is the biosphere, and this includes everything on Earth, in the water, in the atmosphere, just everything here on planet Earth. Within the biosphere, you have ecosystems. So if we look at Darwin, his ecosystem that he looked at was the Galapagos Islands. Within ecosystems, you have communities. So upon all of those islands, there were iguanas. Within communities, you have populations. So if we're looking at a population of iguanas, so instead of looking at all the iguanas on all of the islands, we focus on one population on one island. And within that population, you have organisms. So here we have one iguana organism. If we look inside the organism, you have organs, and within organs, you have tissues. Tissues, you have organelles, cells, nucleus, and then inside all of that, you finally have DNA, which is made up of molecules and atoms. So you can see that you go from very large to very small. So again, the biosphere consists of everything. It's all the environments on Earth that support life, including soil, ocean, lakes, and other bodies of water, as well as the lower atmosphere. At the other extreme from the biosphere, you have the biological size, and the complexity are microscopic molecules, such as DNA and the chemical responsible for inheritance. Again, so you can have anything from very broad to very small. And that each new level, novel properties emerge that are absent from the preceding one. So if you look at an environment, if you look at the biosphere versus just the community will have new properties that emerge as you zoom into it. These emerging properties are due to the specific arrangement and interactions of parts in an increasing complex system. So in the entire biosphere, there may not be a change in, say, weather. However, if you look smaller at the ecosystem level or community level, you can see that you have Sahara Desert, which is extremely dry, versus Seattle, Washington, which is extremely wet. These emergent properties are due to specific arrangement and interactions of parts in an increasing complex system. Such properties are called emergent because they emerge as complexes increase. So as you move down to a smaller scale, you see more and more attributes that are composed of that system. So again, you have the global climate is another example of interconnectedness within the biological systems that operates on a much larger scale. So the global climate overall might be heating up. However, if you look at weather, you may have a snowstorm in the middle of July because that is on a much smaller scale, so you have emerging factors. And throughout the study of life, we see countless interconnections that operate at and between every level of the biological hierarchy. So you can see as you zoom in how they interconnect with one another, but then you also have these emergent properties that appear as you go from one class to the next. So biologists are investigating life at many levels, from interactions in the biosphere to the molecular machinery within the cells. So my background is in molecular biology, so I looked at cells, organelles, organs, and a single organism. But that's about where my study stopped. However, you have ecologists who look at the whole biosphere, look at communities, look at populations, and don't really worry about so much with these smaller ecosystems, cells, organelles, etc. So within biology, you have these different classifications. All right, so this brings us to an end of chapter 1, so we're going to go ahead and jump to chapter 2. which is the chemistry for biology. So while this is a biology course, you do have to understand some chemistry in order to make sense of the biology. So some examples of why chemistry matters. You have coinage, so you have copper coins, which are actually mostly made out of nickel that we use as currency. You have a lemon, which has a sour flavor, it gives food its flavor or attributes. You also have salt, which adds flavor or saltiness. Another thing with chemistry is radioactivity. So you can have radioactivity, which is the emission of high-energy particles that can penetrate living tissues and kill cells by damaging DNA. However, you can also have beneficial radiation, which can be medically beneficial in helping to treat cancers. So when radiation is most dangerous, when it's exposed, when it's uncontrolled, and when it covers most or all of the body, when it's not fine, such as when a person is exposed to radioactivity fallout from a nuclear detonation or an accident. So if you think back to Chernobyl, back in Russia, decades ago now, that was the core went into melted down, and then they had a release of radiation that was not controlled, and it penetrated all of the workers' entire bodies, and so you had a lot of casualties from that. However, when you can control the radiation, you can use it for medical therapy by exposing only a single cell or a single group of cells to a specific dosage of radiation. This provides a large and deadly dose of cancerous cells, but mostly spares the healthy cells around it. So not only can you control the amount of radiation, but you can control the area at which the radiation is affecting. So it only kills the tumor cells while leaving the remaining untumor cells healthy. So what makes something radioactive? So many questions about life can be reduced to questions about chemicals and their interactions. And the knowledge of chemistry is therefore essential to understanding biology. So to understand why something is radioactive and how it affects biology or life, we have to understand chemistry behind it. So if you take any biological system apart, and you eventually end up at the chemical level. So again, if we go back, we start with the biosphere, but then you start getting into the cell and the molecules and the compounds and the atoms that interact with one another, and that is essentially, chemistry that you have to understand at the basic level. Chemical reactions are always occurring in the human body, such as during the breaking down of glucose in metabolism. So as I mentioned earlier, matter is everything that occupies space and has mass. And on Earth, there are 3 physical states of matter: solid, liquid, and gas. And all matter has mass, which is a measure of the amount of material in an object. And then an element is a substance that cannot be broken down into substance by chemical reactions. So it is the smallest unit of matter. And a compound is a substance that contains 2 or more fixed elements in a fixed ratio. So for example, water would be a compound because it has 2 hydrogen elements and 1 oxygen element. And all matter is composed of chemical elements. So there are 92 naturally occurring elements, although more can be created. And carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen make up 96% of living matter. Each element has a symbol derived from its English, Latin, or German name. So for example, we have mercury, which comes from its Latin, well, Hg derives its Latin name from hydrogerium, which means liquid silver. You have lead, Pb, come from its Latin name, plumbum, and then you have copper, Cu, also coming from its Latin name. Of the natural occurring elements, 25 are considered essential to human life. So that means 25 elements are required by the living body in order to sustain life, of which the 4 elements, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, make up 96% of the weight of the body. So if we break that out into a diagram, you can see oxygen takes up more than half of the matter of a life form or a human, taking up 65%. You have carbon, which takes up 18.5%. You have hydrogen, which takes up 9.5%, and nitrogen, which takes up 3.3%. You also have a number of macronutrients, such as calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chloride, and manganese. And then you have trace elements, which make up less than 0.01%, but are required in order to sustain life. So much of the 4% is accounted for by those 7 elements I listed, and these would be those macronutrients, such as calcium, which is required for strong bones and teeth, and then phosphorus, which is used as a component of DNA and is used in plasma membranes, so the surrounding of the cell. And then you have the 0.01 trace elements, which are required in only small amounts and can become toxic if you get too much of them, but they are essential for life. So iodine is an example. When you have deficiencies, it causes a goiter. And then fluorine can also cause deficiencies, and so a lot of the times it is added to dental products or water to help maintain bones and teeth. And when you don't have these trace elements, such as iodine, you can see that you have a goiter here, as this woman does, and so iodine is also often added to salt in order to make sure that everyone takes enough iodine in their diet. And then elements can combine to form compounds, substances that contain 2 or more elements in a fixed ratio. So common compounds that I'm sure you're familiar with is sodium chloride, or table salt, or H2O, water. So each of these compounds, both table salt and water, will be identical, where they will have 1 element of sodium, 1 element of chloride, or 2 elements of hydrogen and 1 element of oxygen. And each element consists of 1 type of atom. And so an atom is the smallest unit of matter that still retains the properties of an element. So an atom is basically one element. So an element would be the broad category, so it would be the plural form. An atom would be a singular form. So atoms are composed of subatomic particles. So you have a proton, which is positively charged and has an atomic mass unit of 1. You have an electron, which has a negative charge and has no weight, or negligible weight. And then you have a neutron, which is a neutral charge and has an atomic mass of 1. And when an atom has an equal number of protons and electrons, it is considered to have a net zero charge, or neutral. So it's not positive or negative. So most atoms have protons and neutrons, which are packed tightly in the nucleus. The nucleus is the atom's core, and then electrons move about on the outside. So if you take hydrogen, for example, which is the smallest, simplest element, if it was the size of a baseball, the nucleus, which would be the protons and the neutrons, would be the size of a pea in the center of a baseball field, while the electrons would be a gnat flying around in the stands. That's the amount of space that's different between the electron and the nucleus, and then the size comparison of a pea versus a gnat. So an atom's atomic mass is the sum of its protons and its neutrons, which can change slightly based on the number of neutrons in an element. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So atoms of various elements differ in the number of subatomic particles. An element's atomic number is the number of protons in its nucleus, and this is specific for an element. So every hydrogen element has one proton. Every helium has two protons. An electron's mass number is the sum of its protons and neutrons. Both protons and neutrons have an atomic mass unit of 1, but the number of neutrons can change from element to element, so the mass number doesn't necessarily need to be identical between two individuals of the same element. So the atomic mass is the atom's total mass, which means it would be both the protons, neutrons, and electrons. However, the electrons are so light that the mass number is essentially the same as the atomic mass. So if we look at a diagram here of helium, you can see in the nucleus you have two protons, which are those red-pink bubbles with the pluses because they're positively charged, and two neutrons, which are those brown spheres that have no charge. In the cloud that surrounds them, you have two electrons, which are those yellow minus charges, that fly by at incredibly high speeds around the nucleus. So isotopes are alternate mass forms of an element. So they have the same number of protons, otherwise they wouldn't be the same element, and then they have the same number of electrons, assuming they're neutrally charged, but they differ in the number of neutrons. So in hydrogen, you can have the most simple hydrogen isotope, which is one proton, one electron. But you can also have a hydrogen molecule that has one proton, one neutron, and one electron. Or you can have a heavier isotope that has one proton, two neutrons, and one electron. So they're all hydrogen because they all just have one proton. They're all neutrally charged because they always have one electron, but the number of neutrons differs, so their atomic mass will differ. Another example is carbon. So you have carbon-12, which is the most common form of carbon. It has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. So it has a mass of 12, 6 from the protons, 6 from the neutrons. Next you have carbon-13. Because it's carbon, you have 6 protons, but 7 neutrons, so you have an extra neutron, and then 6 electrons. So the proton number change stayed the same, but the atomic mass, or the mass number, increased by 1. You also have carbon-14, which again, because it's carbon, you have 6 protons. But in this case, you have 8 neutrons, so you have a mass number of 14, and then you still have 6 electrons. So some of these isotopes can be radioactive, which means that they decay spontaneously. So carbon-14 is a radioactive isotope. So it will degrade to carbon-13 or carbon-12. And when it does, it gives off radiation, which can damage cellular molecules and pose health risks if it's not contained. So natural sources of radiation can also pose a threat, such as radon, which is a radioactive gas. It's a carcinogen that can cause lung cancer. So when you have an element of radon that is radioactive, it then gives off energy and decomposes, which can be dangerous, but can also be tested for whenever you buy a home. So a lot of houses and homes, especially older homes, have to be tested to make sure that they don't have any elements that are decaying, which are giving off radiation. So finally, what I'm going to leave you with today is that cells use radioactive isotopes the same way that non-radioactive isotopes of the same element. So a plant can take up a CO2 molecule that has carbon-12 or carbon-14 in it. And once the cell takes up the radioactive isotope, the location and the concentration of the isotope can be detected because of the radiation it emits. And we can use this, specifically carbon-14, because carbon-14 has a half-life, which means it decays spontaneously at a certain rate. Every 5,370 years, it would decay. And so, as scientists, we can measure the amount of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in a fossil, in a wood, and that will tell us how old the object is. And so we can use it as a tracer to monitor living organisms. Okay, so that's what I'm going to end with today. We'll pick up from this spot on Monday, as well as talk about the assignment that I will also hand out on Monday. And again, I apologize for the Zoom link malfunction, and hopefully we will avoid any more problems in the future.